So I think, all right, let's start this week's meeting slash podcast. So we're talking about affirmative action this week. At least that's how we're going to start the conversation. So, do you want to go first, Michael? And since you suggested the topic, and maybe you can give us a little summary on what affirmative action is and why you're interested in talking about it. I did some reading after you suggested to me, and I think it's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, so a friend of mine was discussing this with me. I forgot exactly what prompted it, but yeah, it's just a controversial topic in general. So it's about increasing the representation of either minority groups or groups that are historically discriminated against, increasing their representation in both or providing them with more educational or employment opportunities, maybe giving them a little boost in like either the college admission process or the job application process. So obviously it's kind of controversial because if you're helping out one group, then it seems that it would follow that you have to be making it more difficult for the majority group at the same time. I guess like college admissions is kind of a zero-sum game. If you're letting more people of one group in, then you have to be accepting less of the majority group. And then, another reason why some people don't like it is because they feel like those people from the minority group that get in, sometimes there's more qualified candidates they believe from the majority group that didn't get in for that reason. So those are some of the arguments against it. The arguments for it are that it's necessary to counteract either past or current discrimination. So one common argument is that I've heard about this study that what they do is they take they take a resume and they apply to certain companies, but with a white sounding name. And then they take the same resume and they apply to different companies, but except put an African American sounding name on it. And some studies say that when they send it out with African American name, it's 3 times less likely to get a call back. So different arguments for and against it. But that is the general idea.
So, what's your and you as well, David? I mean, do you guys have like a starting position as whether you think it's a good idea or not, or if it's maybe you're not entirely sure?
So yeah, I guess I'll go first. Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I think it could be good. I don't know how effective it really is at addressing the root cause of certain issues. I think it might be more addressing the symptoms. Just because it's addressing the symptoms doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't do it. Like for example, whenever you take a Tylenol, if you have like a fever, you're addressing the symptoms rather than the cause. But so that in and of itself doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But I think there's other issues that can still come with it, which is that I think it is true that if you're giving one group an advantage in admissions, then you will inevitably accept students that might be less qualified than if you didn't give that group an advantage. And so I think what happens sometimes is that the discrimination can sometimes be reinforced because those sort of less qualified students are are getting into the university, let's say, and so they end up not performing as well. Maybe they have a higher dropout rate, and so sometimes it kind of reinforces the discrimination. So yeah, I know I didn't give a concrete answer either way, but that's
No. I mean, we're not here to give concrete answers. I think, if you want concrete answers, don't listen to this conversation, or any of the conversations. But so because we're just thinking about things. But I would add, I think you're saying it cannot, it can inadvertently contribute to reinforcing stereotypes, but also similarly, it could also generate a certain degree of resentment, right? Because so in that way, it could backfire, because then you have these people, say for example, white people become resentful that, and in fact, this happens, that, oh, I didn't get in, but that African American student got in, for example, and didn't get as good grades as I did. So it can kind of like backfire. It can like generate resentment in that community as well.
Yeah.
So that's another unintended effect. What about you, David? What are your thoughts?
I guess for me, I feel like we have to do something, but at the same time, I wonder if it if it if we're going to make decisions about who can attend a college or who gets a job based on race, we have to be go into that thinking about what has to happen for us to end this.
To end this?
Yeah, to end it. In other words, there's no question but what people of color have been mistreated in our country, in our history. But if we're going to try to correct that by instituting new rules that favor them, then we have to begin doing that with some idea of a limit to it. How do we end it? How do we stop making decisions based on race? Because isn't that precisely what we don't want?
Yeah, you're kind of saying we don't want it to extend indefinitely. It's kind of you're kind of hoping it's more of a temporary issue than a permanent issue.
Well, I guess I'm saying that, and maybe it's 10 years, maybe it's 20 years, maybe it's 100 years. I don't know, but we have to have some idea of the ideal that we are seeking, and we have to have some idea when we begin reaching that ideal. That makes sense.
Some kind of a measurable, either like, even if it's like measurable in a subjective way, at least some kind of a metric that we're trying to get at, I guess.
So yeah. Do you think it would be something that could be pursued in the short term, but there would have to be sort of an end goal, like you're saying, or it's not a good idea to start with to even like try to go there?
Oh, were you asking David or me?
I was asking David, but
well,
it can be, I can be asking you as well. It's a three-way conversation.
It's fine. I don't know the right thing to do. I know something has to be done, but I don't necessarily know the right thing to do. But at the same time, I don't think we can go on forever and ever making decisions based on race.
Okay.
We've done that too long. and it didn't work out well for us.
Yeah.
So we need to change it, and maybe we need to make decisions based on race, but we have to understand what we're doing, because we can't just do that forever and ever, you know.
Yeah, I guess I see. So it's like we did it the wrong way in the past, and so does that mean we indefinitely must do it the opposite way in the future? Or yeah, I guess. And this is like a common question. Like, can we ever fix what we did wrong? Is there ever a point where we can say we fixed what we did wrong, or is it never really possible to fix what we did? This
Well,
isn't. Yeah.
it's to me, it's important that we understand what we mean when we say we,
Yeah.
because as a general principle, we don't punish the
Descendants.
the children and grandchildren of people who do awful things.
Yeah.
At the same time, and this may be where we start to get into reparations discussion, that some white people have gotten an unfair advantage. Maybe most white people, not all, because I know some people that are very, very poor.
Yeah, that's in fact that's another argument. I think it's a pretty strong argument against the affirmative action in some cases, is the fact that you are giving opportunities to some communities, but at the same time you are excluding other communities, right? If you're favoring, say, African Americans, but you're not giving say Hispanics the same opportunities, or Asian Americans the same opportunities, Native Americans the same opportunity, or in general poor communities the same opportunities. This is just obviously just one example, but I'm talking about, for example, one example that by giving one specific underprivileged community, you're also excluding a bunch of other underprivileged communities. So maybe there are ways to go around that, but it's kind of difficult at the end of the day for you to include all the underprivileged communities, because even if you say, well, all non-whites, or let's say in America, all non-whites are qualified to have this advantage, right? But at the same time, there are lots of people that you would in theory consider whites that do not have those advantages, and in fact they have been very underprivileged in the past, and there are many of those communities. So it's tricky. I think it's a powerful argument against it, and it's, in my opinion, it's hard to go around that.
Yeah, it's very, because it's like, how do you slice and dice the population? Because there's many different ways a person can be disadvantaged. So race is one way that someone can, and obviously it's not 100% correlation, So we're talking about like averages, right? And there's many different ways that a person can be disadvantaged. So when we talk about affirmative action, do we kind of choose that one just because it's a simple one to identify? Well, I guess there are others that exist, but maybe like disabled people maybe get advantages in certain respects. In other respects, women or in other respects, I guess women are given a certain I guess extra consideration for certain jobs or opportunities. So it's kind of like we choose the ones that are the most obvious, right? Like race, gender, disability, sometimes like if you're a veteran or not. But what about the more subtle ones? What about the disadvantages that don't, just pop out right away, but there's still disadvantages, like someone's father's an alcoholic, or someone, things like that.
Yeah, and there are lots of communities, for example, in, very poor states, for example, Oklahoma or, Alabama or something like that, and you will have pockets of the population that are very underprivileged, and they don't qualify. I mean, they're not African Americans or Native Americans or anything like that, so they're probably not going to get those advantages in affirmative action programs. Pretty certain that they won't, but at the same time, they are coming from a position of disadvantage that is substantial in the opportunities that they had to prepare. So I'm like you guys. I think these policies, I mean, they come from a good place, right? People are trying to do what is right and create a more equality in society, which I think it's a great thing. It's a good intention for the most part, unless you have different ideas. Like if you don't want equality in society, maybe you have a different idea about it. But I think for most people, this day and age, we acknowledge that trying to create a fair and more equal society, I think that's a good thing. But at the same time, and going back to what you said, David, people have been doing the race thing, for example, dividing with the criterion of race before, and it obviously didn't work out all that well. I mean, at least for a lot of people, it didn't. So to continue to insist in the same mistake, and yes, you can make the argument that before it was about exclusion, now it's about inclusion or whatever. I mean, those are valid arguments, but at the same time, and again, I defer to what David said, right? Like, how long can we keep, insisting on this issue of dividing people, or like you said, Michael, like society into little bits? Like it's hard to see how this will produce good results if done indefinitely.
I guess just because there are other disadvantaged people that like disadvantaged white people that aren't getting the same benefits of affirmative action doesn't mean we should stop it necessarily. Maybe we should also include them in the program. You know what I mean? Like, so I guess, but then it just becomes a really tricky program to administer, right? So I guess what I'm saying is, it's kind of like there's this desire to create a program that helps underprivileged people, right? And there's a few obvious ways that people are underprivileged that stick out really easily. So you could try to use the program to help those first. But then if you try to expand it to include the less obvious categories, then it becomes a hard program to administer. You know what I mean? Because there's so many different ways people could be disadvantaged that if you try to create a program that incorporates all of them, then it's just a really hard program to administer, right?
Yeah, I think it will be very difficult if we try to include provisions for all underprivileged people at all times. I mean,
but just because we can't do it for every class doesn't mean we shouldn't do it for any, I guess is what I'm saying.
True. Yes, that is.
And if I could just add, I don't think all of the solution has to do with law. Some of it has to do with persuasive effort on our part.
Yeah, most affirmative action programs are not required by law, right? Most of them are voluntary by either the college or the employer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, they have, because they've been challenged legally, because they are a form of discrimination. No matter how we look at it, they're a form of discrimination. Everybody knows they're a form of discrimination. The only question is this a form of discrimination that actually is intended to produce good results? But again, it's very tricky. What's good results, right? But as a general rule, let's say in that I shared a lecture with you guys, Harvard lecture, and it was actually one of the she actually added she said in one case there was malice, and in the other case there was no malice. So way to put it, but in both cases are discrimination. Hi, Sashir.
I just dropping in for a little while, so I'm here in Rome. Enjoying.
You just cut out in and out a little bit.
Oh, I'm here for a little while. I'm here in Rome, enjoying the Colosseum.
That's great, man.
Nice.
How's Rome? How's the weather?
It's very hot.
I bet.
Actually, I'm gonna I have a sweater on, but yeah, it's like 85 degrees out. I don't know why I'm wearing it. Yeah.
So I'm glad you could join us this year. Let us know what do you think about affirmative action? Do you think it's a good policy to have or a bad policy? What are your initial thoughts?
Mixed. It really kind of depends how it's done. I mean, there certainly is a place to address traditionally underrepresented groups, but I think it does get problematic to a certain extent when you're starting to lower standards.
Yeah, I think that's one issue is that whenever you give one group an advantage in admissions, that the people that you end up accepting are likely to be less qualified, right? And sometimes that perpetuates discrimination because, like at a university, the minority group then might have a lot of less qualified students, and so that would sort of just perpetuate the discrimination. So I guess that I feel like that form of addressing the issue, the problem is it's kind of addressing, like we said, the symptom rather than the cause. And so I don't know. Yeah, I don't have the exact answer, but yeah, I feel like that's one issue with it.
Well, I kind of like the way Texas does it, the University of Texas, where basically they take they say automatically 5% of students from any Texas public high school can get into the University of Texas. Because I think what that does then is, rather than saying it's a racial set aside and saying we're just trying to meet a quota of a certain amount of race, so we'll take it. It basically just says we're getting the top students at Texas, but because there's so much disparity among locations in Texas, it sort of addresses the racial disparity. Okay.
So it's more like geographic diversity rather than racial diversity.
Right? Yes, exactly.
I think that's kind of an interesting point, because I do think that the racial sort of affirmative action, I think that's not generally speaking, that's not a good idea. I think even though it comes from a place of good intentions, I think that and again, like what you said, David, before, I mean and I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, the insisting on this issue of race and keep discriminating people based on race, I just don't think it's going to solve any problems. I think it's just going to make things worse, regardless of the intentions. So I think that's a bad idea, but you can introduce other sorts of, it's not even discrimination, but you can favor some qualities of people or some situations. For example, I think one case in which it makes some sense is the police. When you favor having policemen that come from a certain background to work in a certain place, like more local, for example, that could help with some issues.
Yeah, because a policeman, like that job can be a very, I mean, like a lot of people, are kind of intimidated by the police. It's kind of scary when a cop comes up to you, right?
Yeah, it's very scary. But if you know the cop, right? I mean, it's a different situation. If the cop also knows the people, I mean, that can create a bond between police and community, and that's not really discrimination. That's just you're really choosing the best people for that job.
Yeah, I think in terms of police officers, I think it makes sense that you want a pretty diverse group of them. Yeah.
But you don't. I think the way to go about it is not to go around and say, like if you're black, you have a better chance of being a policeman. Like then you kind of you're still dividing. See, the intention is good, but I mean, that's not going to have long term. That's not going to have good results because people are still going to be thinking constantly in terms of white cop, black cop,
Yeah.
and that's not good. That's not even the relationship between white cops and black cops are not going to be great if on the back of their mind the white cops are thinking, well, you just got that job because you're a black person. It's not a good basis to start a good relationship, working relationship. But if the criteria are different, like let's try to get people that are local, that are part of this community, that represent the community. Well, that's a whole different story, right? That makes sense. I think everybody would support that, and that would certainly produce better results. But then we're not, it's not the same thing. We're not separating people into races and giving someone a job because they're from a certain race or which are kind of like constructed anyways, right? But who's black, who's white, exactly? What if someone's mixed race? He doesn't get a job, right? Yeah. So, right. So I think affirmative action could be an answer in some situations, but it shouldn't be this racial discrimination thing. I think that's a bad way to go about it.
Well, one of the main reforms put forward for law enforcement is requiring police officers to live in the locality that they police. I know for Minneapolis, it's a very small number. I think like less than 20% of Minneapolis PD actually live in Minneapolis.
It is. I think it's less than 10%. I think in Brooklyn Center, there's I think it's 0% actually. I think I saw it the other day. I think 0% of the police force live in Brooklyn Center.
That's
so
crazy.
Not a single person.
So yeah, you're having people that live in a different area policing another area. Yeah, I agree. There could be a lot of benefit from that rule.
It's very different because they come into a place, and if you come from a rich suburb in the Twin Cities and you come into Brooklyn Center, which is not not super nice or not super rich, I should say, and they come with the sole intention of controlling people from that neighborhood or that city, I guess. It's kind of like an occupied territory for them. They go into that territory to work, and what's their work? They have to police people, and then they leave at the end of the day and they go home. So it's a very different situation than if you have at least some of the people that they live in the community, right? And they kind of this is a place. This is not an occupied territory. This is we're taking care of our people, our community. It's a very different situation.
I understand what you're saying, and I think I understand what you're after, but I need help differentiating what what Bruno and Michael are describing from evolving into a good old boy network. In other words, if you favor local people,
Mhm.
could that evolve into a good old boy network where, yeah, I know his daddy.
That's usually the complaint of rural police forces, but it's a little bit different for larger cities.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, David. I don't know. Do you want to try to tackle it, Michael? I think you make a good point, and yeah, it does raise a concern.
Like you're just saying there would be kind of like nepotism, or like just people would just hire their friends or whatever.
Well, in other words, if sticking to the issue at hand, If
Yeah.
you favor one group over another, does that create problems?
Yeah, I think it's a little different though when you're favoring, like in the context of police officers, like choosing them from the place that the people live in. I think it's like different because I think that's part of the qualification of being a, like, I think that is one of the things that would make them a good candidate for being a police is living in the area because they they know the people better. Yeah, I guess I think that's one of the qualifications. So it's not like a corrupt kind of an advantage. It's like a real advantage.
I understand that, and I think I agree, but at the same time, let's take something not quite as difficult to not as many eggshells
Yeah,
to
yeah,
walk on. A school system. If you favor local people for teachers and administrators, then you, in a to a certain extent, cut yourself off from new blood and new ideas.
yeah. So yeah, I think I see what you're saying. Like, I think it would be good to favor local people for like police, but I don't think it would be good to just only have them or I think it's good to have at least some local people.
Yeah. I mean, you don't need to say like everybody. I don't think Michael is suggesting you say like everybody needs to be living here, right? But you kind of like you try to have at least some people that live in the community. So it's kind of a fluid
I
system.
completely understand and agree with that.
Yeah.
The question I have is, how do you keep what you're suggesting from evolving into something that you don't want?
Yeah.
Police still have to follow them.
So Shir, when you're talking, like your microphone gets muted. I don't know if what's causing that.
But police still have to follow the law.
Yeah, they still have to follow the law.
I understand that.
Yeah, you're saying it would kind of like over time you might get to a situation where it's like all the people who run the police are the same kind of mindset, I guess. That it might evolve into that over time, kind of is what you're saying.
Well, I'm just saying, how do you prevent that?
Yeah.
I think it's you do like a mixed system, right? You have a system in which you kind of like favor the people that live in the area because you need some people that live in the area, but at the same time, it's not like you're gonna stop.
Yeah, I think. Oh, I'm sorry, Bruno. You're cutting in and out a little, but yeah, I think maybe you try to say, it's good to have at least, maybe 30% of them live in the area. And if it's more than that, then we don't even like worry about it. Like if it's clearly like 50% of them live in the area, then you're like, okay, we've met the goal already. We can just. But like if it's like 10%, then you're like, maybe we should do a little something. But yeah, I don't know.
Well, the goal of having people live in the area is so the locals will trust them. Also, so they will know, they'll have better knowledge of the neighborhoods, the ins and outs. But that said, they still have.
So that's a qualification you take into consideration.
Yeah.
Oops, I think we lost David. Sorry, I think we lost Bruno.
Bruno. Yeah, I had David here. But what did it say? David Hubbs is now the leader or something? I don't know. But yeah.
We're definitely in trouble.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, my internet is really giving me trouble tonight.
All right.
We solved all the world's problems while you were gone.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
We're done.
That's helpful. That's helpful. Now we can just talk about, the next James Bond movie, like we were talking before we start recording.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the last one yet. I haven't seen Spectre.
Spectre is a good movie. You should watch it. Not amazing, but pretty good.
Yeah.
So we can so yeah, it's I think we're all kind of in agreement that it has good aspects to it, this affirmative action thing, and it has some bad aspects. um I mean, I think really a better approach would be, because I think, like you said before, Michael, I think it is true. You are dealing with just the symptoms at the end of the day, with these policies. And it's not even so clear that you're addressing the symptoms the right way, but you're certainly not even addressing the causes. And I think you would, if you really want to solve the problem, ultimately, you got to go back, go and solve the causes. For example, just by accepting a black student instead of a white student because you acknowledge that black students didn't have the same opportunities in a certain place. Uh, well, I guess that levels the playing field, but it also, like we've been talking about, creates a slew of other problems. But what really you would want really is to go into why did those black students not have the same opportunities. What went wrong there? Why is it so clear that we're acknowledging that there's not a level playing field? And yes, we can't change what happened in the last 400 years, but what can be done is that we can have schools that white students and black students can go to the same schools, equally funded, with the same opportunities to study and to prepare themselves to be in the same sort of position when they apply to university. And this applies to applying for jobs later on, and all that. I mean, I think the real fantastic thing about modern societies now, and the American society, for example, is how finally we're at a place that we all kind of are in agreement that people should have the same opportunities. And that's a great place to be, because we can build some sort of meritocratic system. You don't build a meritocratic system by saying, well, we're going to favor the black person over the white person. Not, whoever's doing that is doing that from a place of good intentions, but ultimately the way you build a meritocratic system is by addressing the root causes, right? By making sure everybody has the opportunity in the first place, the same opportunities, that they can rise in society. And it really doesn't matter what happened before, as long as you guarantee that in the present.
Now, some people, just to play devil's advocate, some people argue affirmative action is meritocratic. So I'm just going to take their view for a second. They say that discrimination currently exists. So, like for example, let's say that you have a black person and a white person, and let's say the black person has a black sounding name, right? And you send out an identical resume, but just one with the white person's name and one with the black person's name. Send it out to a bunch of employers, and the one with the black name hears back 3 times less. So a proponent of affirmative action might say that it increases meritocracy because it kind of corrects for that discrimination that occurs, if that makes sense.
Well, and I think what you're driving at is that even people who may not have enslaved people for 12, 13 generations have nevertheless enjoyed some advantages because of it.
Oh, I'm not even saying that. I'm saying some people say that equally qualified minorities are still discriminated against and given less of a chance without any affirmative action. And so that affirmative action has to be done to counteract that. So proponents of it, some would say that it is meritocratic because it's fighting existing discrimination.
Well, it's supposed to even out the previous,
It's not,
but there is,
it's not just leveling out past disadvantages. Some proponents of it argue it counteracts current discrimination, the discrimination going on today.
well, that is the original argument too, is that yes, that schools weren't taking, people, minorities, even though you could say that minorities can go to schools, but if schools aren't admitting them, for whatever reason, then you got to basically you're forcing their hand. That was the original idea behind it. Current affirmative action kind of goes with that. Well, there's these pre-existing already advantages to being white or being others versus pre-existing disadvantages. One of this has to do with that the buildup of wealth, particularly. And so one of the arguments goes is that even if you can say that, a school might admit a black student as much as a white student, provided they're equal, is that white students tend to have more of an advantage because they tend to be wealthier. So they tend to have more opportunities to get better tutoring, or, in school, they have better chance to do more electives and things like that tend to appeal to college admissions.
But some people argue, and I'm not 100% sure how much I'm convinced by this, but some people argue that you could have a black person and a white person with exactly the same upbringing, exactly the same, I don't know, their parents were equally wealthy, parents were equally educated, exactly the same everything, and that the black person would be discriminated against and given a lower chance for jobs today. I think it's less than in the past. I'm not.
Yes.
Yeah.
Come up. There's quote the implicit bias.
Yeah, the implicit bias. A lot of people say that, yeah, affirmative action is needed to counteract sort of implicit bias. And yeah, I'm not sure how swayed I am by that, but just bringing it up as one of the arguments out there.
Well, there is evidence for it. I mean, like you said, there's a study regarding black and white applicants or black sounding name. Then there's also case recently there, I think it might have been 60 Minutes or someone did a recent look at property values. So if a bank or a realtor found out that it was a black person who owned this house, they would undervalue it versus if it was a white person. In some cases, it could be the exact same house, and they could change it by like $100,000 of the value of the house.
Interesting.
Well, I think you make a good point, Michael, and I think that's one situation that we can consider. Well, people actually do have the same kinds of qualities, but in one case, just because of the perception of other people, right, or their preconceptions, their prejudice, they're not going to get a fair shot, right? So in that case, yeah, I think that is a good argument for affirming meritocracy with affirmative action policies. However, I would say I'm still not convinced by it. I think you can implement it. I mean, and again, it comes from a good place. It comes from a place of trying to make society better. Ultimately, though, in my opinion, in my judgment, I think a better way to go about, much better way to go about it, is to enforce non-discrimination, laws instead of doubling down on the discrimination and say, okay, let's discriminate against those people instead. Just to balance it out. I would say, well, let's make sure we don't discriminate.
Period.
Yeah.
It's kind of like fighting fire with fire. It's saying that, or
I think so. Yeah.
So I guess people who argue for affirmative action for that reason, they're saying minorities are discriminated against this way, so we have to discriminate the other way to counteract it.
Yes. It amounts to that. That's what that argument amounts to. And look, maybe it works. And certainly it comes from a place of good intentions. However, is that really the way we want to go about it? I think it's not the way we should go about it.
Yeah, no, it is like fighting fire with fire, because in the long run, kind of like David said, we don't want to have to discriminate ideally in the long run, if possible, which people argue, is this ever going to be possible? But in an ideal world, we want to get to a point where we don't discriminate based on race. So to have to counteract current discrimination with other discrimination is kind of, yeah, not the best maybe, but yeah.
Right, but implicit bias. Go ahead.
Sashir, the microphone it keeps muting when you speak. Can you just leave it unmuted, maybe? You're
think it's
muting
when somebody
yourself.
else
I don't know
speaks.
what's happening.
When somebody else speaks at the same time, it starts kind of. I don't have my main microphone plugged in too. That might be why.
But I guess when you
I think
stop
Bruno's
talking,
frozen.
oh, it's this year, when you stop talking, it shows you on mute. So are you clicking mute?
Yes, I'm using. Well, I was using because usually when I'm on Zoom calls, I don't. When I talk, I just hit the space bar to unmute.
Okay. All right. So yeah, so we were talking about, yeah, sort of affirmative actions of
Yeah, the
ways.
fighting fire with fire analogy, which I think is a good analogy.
Yeah.
But I think that we have to have some idea of what assessment or authority we rely on to tell us when we're done.
Yeah. Or when we've reached a point where we think we've gotten it to a good enough level, basically.
Yeah. And that may not be for 100 years, but we need to know when that is, or if not when, we need to know what the criteria are for saying, oh, we've conquered this problem.
Yeah, and I think it's so tricky because I think it's more than just economic. I think a lot of it is psychological. A lot of it is just, culture passed on for many, many generations where you just, remember stories about how your ancestors were disadvantaged. So a lot of it is not purely economic. A lot of it is kind of emotional, I guess, right? And so it's very hard to put a line in the sand on that. But I guess you can't just. I guess there has to be some point at which we start moving on, right? I don't know.
Well, even if we don't know everything, we have to know something.
We have to know something. Yeah.
Well, this is where implicit bias comes in. I mean, this is a question on whether, because we can debate whether implicit bias exists. I think there's a good argument that it does, but how do you address that? And it's a difficult. I mean, if you look at statistics now, it still shows that Blacks and Hispanics are generally underperforming in regard to their proportion of the population compared to other groups. I mean, Asians are overperforming compared to their population, but that's not exactly even within the Asian population because groups like Hmong are not performing. So there's other factors.
The part of the problem, I think, though, is this these categories, because Asians is not a real category. Like, that's not a real category of people. Like it is in if you want to make it a category, but it's not. Like, Japanese people are not the same as Chinese people. They're not the same as Thai people. Like, Indians somewhat fell into like no man's land there, but they're Asian as well. But it's really just grouping people that have really different situations and putting them in the same box. Like, Japanese people that immigrated to the United States, they did not have the same circumstances that Chinese people that immigrated to the United States. Hmong people did not have the same circumstances either. So for you to compare, for example, a Hmong person to a Chinese person just on the basis that they're Asian, it's really just a fiction.
True. That's true, but I mean, Asian or categorization is technically, as a minority, is not so much of a choice. I mean, it is something that basically kind of defines. I mean, yes, Chinese and Japanese historically don't like each other. Koreans don't like either. But that said, we've been kind of lumped in. I mean,
Yeah,
No,
and
but my
I
I'm
think
sorry.
what Bruno is saying is that there, another way of saying it is there are Canadian Americans and there are Central Americans. They're both Americans, but they're not the same.
Yeah, they're not the same and they don't have the same circumstances and they did not immigrate under the same circumstances. Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So that category is a pretty flawed, category, no
In other
matter how
words,
you look at it.
a single category doesn't cover the whole.
Sure, I agree. I agree.
How can you really compare a Hmong person to a Japanese person in terms of how they immigrated to the United States? Like it's just not the same world, right? We're talking to start with. I mean, we're talking about people that have been here for over 100 years, and we're comparing them to people that came over, in the 70s.
Sure,
It's simply not the same scenario, right? So when we talk about Asians, I mean, it's really, it doesn't really mean much.
No, I
You
agree.
know,
There's a lot of
um,
diversity. I think what I'm trying to say though is this is not a category by choice necessarily. I mean, certain
right.
situations.
And I agree with you. I'm just saying it's not like really a real thing. I mean, it's like saying that Mexican Americans are the same as say Argentinian Americans. It's again, yes, you can say they're both Hispanic, but it's really just a grouping that for the sake of grouping people into one box, but it's a completely different situation. It's like, maybe someone is escaping a situation of extreme poverty. They come into the board, they come into the country, illegally. They're running from drug lords. They come here and, they have $10 on their pockets, and you're comparing that to, like, say, an Argentinian doctor that, immigrated because they had a chance to immigrate in the United States. They're going to make more money, but they come with a college background. It's a completely different situation. And like to make a comparison like that, we're just not talking about the same situation. We're talking about very different situations.
Right. Except again, no, I fully agree with you. Except again, I'm saying these are things that are not necessarily applied to us. Now, in terms of, you can say that a German American and an Irish American came under different circumstances too.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
If you look at the history of America, why there has actually been discrimination towards Germans and Irish Americans in terms of basically the racial laws of America, as they were accepted as Americans. I mean, I can speak from the history of Asian Americans, was that Asians couldn't vote, really. Asians didn't have any rights up until well into U.S. history. I mean, there was an exclusion act that was passed against German Americans or Irish Americans, even when the U.S. was at war against Germany. So, again, these weren't categories that, as Asian people, we chose. That said, it's part of the history. Now, I will say this about Asians regarding the Asian American movement is that, yes, there have been groups of Asians have kind of seen a commonality. And largely that's in response to kind of the situation of the racial history of the U.S., that it actually does help a certain extent to have Asians lumped together in terms of mutual support and addressing other issues. But in the end, yeah, if there wasn't this difference, yeah, I don't think Chinese or Japanese Americans would particularly care that much about each other or see each other the same, but any more than you could say that, Irish and English Americans, in fact, they hate each other historically. If you're an Irish Catholic versus a Protestant,
it's not really the same. When you're comparing them, you're not really comparing people that came under the same circumstances. I mean, it seems that way now, sort of. But I've been, because I had an exam for a job, for a public job. So I was studying quite a bit of American history, and our perception now of this category of like the white people, like, for example, Irish people weren't really included in, maybe they were included, I guess, in the white people category, but they certainly weren't included like in the, say, Anglo-Saxon category of people that were established here, like they were really second-class citizens, and they came into a situation of that they were really at the bottom of society, almost at the bottom of society, right? So the perception of Irish Americans in the beginning of the 20th century would have been completely different from the perception of Irish Americans as, part of this privileged society in the beginning of the 21st century. So, but the way some of these groups have blended into society in general shows that if people don't pay too much attention into this, if they don't have to be labeled all the time, you're an Irish American, you're Jewish, you're Finnish, you're Italian. Like if you're not having to point this out all the time, and if people don't need to like consider themselves part of these communities, these boxes all the time, they eventually blend in and they make their way in the world, right? But I think if people insist in categorizing people as different and as not part of the society, I think it's very difficult for people to blend in and actually make their way in the world and in the country and put themselves in a position that is similar to other people.
Right. Except, no, I agree. And I've studied I know a lot of, is yes, the Irish were discriminated against. They were treated very awful. That said, Irish that came to America could vote. They actually had right. In the late 19th century, Chinese did not have rights. Both the big Chinese immigration in the latter half of the 19th century overlapped a bit with the Irish immigration, and both were oppressed groups in many ways. That said, the Irish they still could become citizens. They still could vote, whereas Chinese could not.
Well, my point is we're in a position now that everybody can be like the Irish, right? Everybody can, for example, in the United States, everybody can come here and sort of blend in and make their way, like in the world. They can be in a position that they can fight for their place, and they can achieve things. And everybody, it's a very good situation that everybody is protected by the law and has been given these opportunities. And yes, there's still discrimination, but people have this opportunity, right? But if we keep insisting on these different boxes and in discriminating, even if we do it in from a place of good intentions, I think it's really counterproductive. I mean,
yeah, I got to get running here soon, but again, yes, that's a noble sentiment, but that's much easier said than done. My point is that, yeah, I can see that all along. The problem is that's not, the history of it is still there. This is when we talk about historical disadvantages that did it. It's easy to just come out and say, well, everybody should be treated the same. We shouldn't discriminate. Sure, yeah, I think we all know that. That said, it still happens. There's still historical disadvantages. I'll give you something that I was thinking about a lot this past year, especially during the summer, is that I'm not that far in age from George Floyd. Both of us are from Houston. We both ended up in Minneapolis. That said, this is odd because yes, I am a minority, and I was talking about discrimination towards Asians, but in some ways, like I said, my experience is different as an immigrant or the child of immigrants who came here. If you looked at pictures of us when both of us were 6 years old, I bet it'd be, and you ask people at random, not knowing anybody, not knowing anything else, not knowing that it was George Floyd or it was me, and you just ask a simple question, a few decades from now, one of these people is going to be an architect, and the other person's going to die under the knee of a police officer in the street. Chances are most people would probably pick the black child, would probably pick the 6-year-old picture of George Floyd. as the one who dies. But this is the key, is that you might not necessarily feel, well, I don't think it's racist. I think this kid could potentially grow up to be an architect too. It's just there's a sense of perception about that. Now, should we say that, George Floyd should have had the chance to do things different? Could he have done his life differently? Certainly, he probably could have. That said, there were expectations based upon who he was, where he came from. I know the neighborhood George Floyd came from. He came from the Third Ward in Houston, CUNY Homes, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods in the U.S. In that said, I lived in an upper middle class neighborhood in Houston. We were only a few miles apart, but I lived a completely different world. Now, I don't know if I had lived in CUNY Homes or if George Floyd had lived where I lived, if our lives would have been reversed. There's no way of absolutely knowing that. The difference is that there are certain expectations that come about because of how you look and where you're from. I'll give you one more interesting historical nugget too, is that my high school was called Maribel B. Lamar, one of the oldest high schools in Houston, in Texas. And at the time I went, it was the flagship of the Houston School District as far as academically. George Floyd went to a school called Yates. And here's what's interesting, that if we're going to talk historical advantages, my high school, Maribel B. Lamar, was the second president of the Republic of Texas. He was also a slave owner. He also, when Texas joined the Union, was the main proponent of Texas joining the Confederacy. Whereas the Yates, where George Floyd went to, was a former slave who'd become a preacher. And you can guess which ones did better academically and which ones did better athletically.
Right.
And so anyway, yeah, no, I get the argument of saying, well, we shouldn't be looking, we certainly shouldn't be discriminating. That said, there's still going to be one, because George Floyd, because of who he was, but also if you talk about kind of a historical nation, he grew up really without a father. And sounds like his father kind of grew up without a father too.
So if I understand what you're saying, you're not disagreeing with Bruno. You're just saying, well, hey, I understand, but at the same time, we still really do have a problem. And
yes, exactly.
What are we going to do about it?
Yes, exactly. I'm just saying, though, just to say, well, we shouldn't be categorized. We shouldn't putting, if I'm calling myself an Asian, maybe I should. That seems like that's the obvious solution. That said, to what extent what we're looked at, how we're perceived, really has very little to do with what we do ourselves. Clearly, and I'm not going to make an argument saying we have no agency. That said, in the nature of where the U.S., even in 2021, is still how you look, where you come from, is still a major factor.
Well, it's always going to be a major factor, but this is the thing. I think in the United States, that gets somewhat, the fact that what you're saying is absolutely true. Like where you come from has a huge impact on where you're going to end up. And that doesn't mean you don't have agency. Of course you have agency, unless we're talking about that whole free will argument, but you have agency. But of course, like your preparation for life, that's going to impact how well you do or how badly you will do. Right. So, but that is not, this is where I think things get excessively racialized. That's not the same as to say, because you're Black or because you're Asian, you're going to end up doing certain things. Really the big difference there is that you come from, like you said yourself, from a place of, middle class or high middle class, from an affluent place of the city, and you went to a good school. He, on the other hand, he grew up in a place that is poor, probably had a lot of crime, not great education, went to a shitty school. Yes, of course that's going to have a huge impact. Of course you're going to become an architect and he's not going to become an architect. he would have to be an exception to become an architect under those circumstances. But that doesn't mean that's the case because you're Asian and people look at you as if you're an Asian, and he's black and people look at him as if he's black. That's really not the big difference. The big difference is the whole preparation for life and the chances you had and the chances that he did not have.
Right, but that's the point, though. He didn't get the same chances because who he was. I mean, yes, race and poverty are inextricably tied together, unfortunately, in the U.S.
Well, yes, but you have to understand that difference. And my argument here is that really, if you want to look at the problem, if you want to solve the problem, I should say, what you do is, why is he growing up in that really poor neighborhood? Why is there a lot of poverty and crime? And why is he going to a shitty school? And then you try to solve those problems, right? That's my argument. But of course,
I think
right, but that would get to affirmative action. Is maybe we should have given George Floyd the chance to go to a better school.
I think I understand what you're saying, Bruno. If I understood what you said, what we have is a problem that is correlated but not necessarily causated.
Yeah, there's a correlation.
Did I use that word right? So it's a correlation, not a causation. But there still is a correlation.
There is a correlation, yeah, and I think we should look at it.
We have to do something about that, right?
Hey guys, this is a good conversation. Unfortunately, I got to run.
Absolutely.
But
Yes, sure.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for.
I think Bruno, you're frozen there for a second. Okay, well, catch you guys later.
My internet sucks today. Bye, Sashir.
Yep,
Have fun
bye.
in Rome.
Yep.
Bye.
Yep.
I feel like Sashir was kind of the one kind of had a lot of like different ideas from us on the topic, but now I feel like we're all I don't know. It makes this interesting discussion.
Maybe we can move on to speak about reparations a little bit, and because you guys wanted to discuss reparations. Yeah. And again, I think our thoughts are kind of aligned as well there, or probably are, but I think it is an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if you can get to the thing with reparations. I feel like a lot of the intent of it is to try to get to a point where it's like, okay, we did what we made up for our mistakes. Now let's move on. But I don't know if any amount of just giving money can settle the psychological or emotional issues that come with everything. Yeah.
Just as a point of clarity, it's not we that did the thing.
It's
but we reaped the benefits of the thing having been done.
Yeah.
So the question is, how much should we pay? And who should pay? Everybody? Everybody?
Yeah, because that's the thing. You would expect
about who should pay made based on the color of the skin.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound right.
But even if we could get a perfectly like I don't even know if in theory if we could do it perfectly, if it would work. Because I don't think there's any dollar amount that would where people would be like, okay, you've done your what do you call it? Like when someone does a crime and now they've done their time in jail and now they can go back and rejoin society.
Yeah.
Kind of I don't think there's any amount we could pay where it's like, okay, you've done your due, now we can move on.
Yeah. I agree with you. And it's not like we have to at least consider, maybe we can't reach a conclusion, but we have to at least consider, do all white people contribute to a fund that benefits all Black people forever?
Oh boy,
Mhm.
that's a can of worms. That is terrible. I think that kind of like settles the argument because that is such a bad idea. Obviously,
I
that
think
I don't think anybody should ever discuss this
No,
again
no.
because that's like the worst thing you can
I
like.
posed
you
the
can do.
question that way because I'm suggesting there has to be some limit in mind. You have to have some idea of how big the problem is that you're paying for before you start paying for it. Yeah, well, maybe not.
I think that the big issue there is like what you guys are saying, right? Who's gonna pay for it? You know, there's no real answer to that question in the first place. If you don't have an answer to that question in the first place, you can't really do it, you know, because who's gonna pay for it?
But even if we did have an answer, I'm going even a step further. So there's a problem. How do we even know who's going to pay for it? Which is a very, very, very big problem. I agree.
It's a huge problem.
I'm going a step further. Even if we did know the answer to that, I think that presumes that this is a problem that is primarily economic, or even like I think it's kind of I think our focus should be like, how should we treat
Just one,
minorities?
I'll be right back, but keep talking.
Well, put it another way.
Yeah.
How much does it cost to enslave people for 12 or 13 generations, millions of people?
Yeah.
Because of the color of their skin. How much does that cost?
You can't put a number on it, but yeah, I think our focus. I don't like reparations because I think it's overly monetarily focused. Whereas I feel like the solution should be just treating people with respect. Yeah, or like.
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
Even if we pass some law of some kind.
Yeah.
To address this problem in some fashion, we still have to persuade a lot of people that it's worthwhile.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, we're going to have to persuade those people that it's worthwhile, whether we pass a law or not.
Yeah, but
we're
just
still
because
going to have to do that.
Yeah, but just because it's difficult, just because like I don't think the fact that it's difficult is the reason why we shouldn't start thinking about it. I think it's for a different reason. So it's like, let's say you know someone and they do something really, I don't know, mean to you, or let's say you have someone like let's say there was someone in your high school who bullied you, right? So
how did you know?
But yeah, so you have
everybody does.
Everybody does. So yeah, you have this guy in your high school, and he bullied you for all 4 years of high school. And now he's an adult, and he comes back and he says, "Hey, I'm going to pay you $100,000 to make up for what I did." And then are we good? See, that it's like you didn't want the money. It's like the money just doesn't feel good. Like just getting money from him, right? See what I mean?
Yeah, that's a very capitalist mentality, you know, like hyper capitalist, you know, like something happened. Okay, we'll give you money, you know, we're good.
That's what I would say.
You know, it's not like that. I agree, Michael. Not everything can be solved by giving people money. I mean, it's not the same thing, you know. Like if you like killed someone's brother, you know, you're not gonna give them money. Hey, now we're good. I mean, it doesn't, you know, it's not the same thing. It doesn't really matter how much money you give them, right? I mean, it's irrelevant. So you're just not gonna solve the problem.
Yeah. So that's kind of why I'm not in favor of reparations, because it kind of takes that mentality, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that's a very I think that's a very strong argument. I think there are several strong arguments, but that's certainly a very big argument.
Now let me just ask a question, and I'm just asking a question, just just to think about it, would your view of reparations be any different if you were black?
That is a good question. And I think it also depends what kind of black person I was, right? If I was an advantaged black person or a disadvantaged person, like what kind of, yeah. But just generically, I think possibly, yeah.
I think I didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry, Mike.
Oh no, you can go ahead. I hadn't fully formed my thoughts.
Well, I mean, I think that my mind wouldn't change. I don't think I would change my mind. I do think that maybe I would change my mind just for the simple fact that everybody likes money, right? So if you're gonna get a bunch of money, yeah, maybe you'll convince yourself to think differently, you know. So in this sense, maybe I would change my mind, but I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're black or not. I mean, what about the Native Americans? I mean, the Native Americans didn't get a very good deal either, right? I mean, they deserve reparations. I mean, if you give black people reparations, you got to give Native Americans reparations as well. If not, I mean, that would be tremendously unfair, right? But in both cases, I think it's a terrible idea.
Yeah. So yeah, in that case, it's kind of like the administrative complexity. So it's like if you give black people reparations, and you got to give Native Americans, and you got to give this group, and you got to give that group. I don't think administrative complexity in and of itself is a reason not to.
No, yeah, and I agree with you. That wasn't even what I was saying, right? I was just saying that.
Yeah, I know that wasn't.
If you do one thing, you got to do the other, or it's tremendously unfair. But of course, that's always a terrible argument for anything, right? It's like when someone says, "Oh no, I can't do that for you," just because I would have to do it for everybody else, right? I mean, it's a terrible argument that people use to justify whatever it is, but I mean, it's a terrible argument always.
Yeah. But yeah, what were we talking about? I forgot. I think David said something, but I was going to reply to it. It's all good.
If it was more than 10 seconds ago, I don't remember either.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Bruno, you were asking what I or no, David, you were asking what I feel differently if I were African American.
That's right.
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard to. This is.
You would like to think not.
Yeah, I would think not. But the thing is, this gets kind of philosophical. If I were an African American with my current views, and if I had my current views, it wouldn't make a difference in the first place. So, in other words, the views I have come from my upbringing, which was generally pretty good. But yeah, I feel like that's almost an impossible question to answer.
Well, what came first, the chicken or the egg?
Yeah, it's like a chicken or the egg problem, right?
Well, I think you're kind of like making you think about another problem that this raises, is that yes, it does depend on people's upbringing. It does depend on, where they're from, and that conditions their way of thinking. But that's also made me think about another problem, which is also not as big as perhaps the ones I mentioned before, but quite a big problem, which is the fact that not everybody is actually entitled, just by being black, to those reparations. Well, theoretical reparation. Nobody should be entitled to that. But someone like Obama, for example, just because he kind of looks black, that doesn't mean, he does not descend from slaves. That's just a high profile example, right? At that point, you would have to demand from people that they prove in a reasonable way that they are descended from slaves, which again is opening a whole.
Otherwise, you're making decisions based solely on the color of the skin.
Yes, just on appearance, which is certainly not something that is reasonable. You can't do that.
So, I mean, but maybe it's worth, because like, I guess the administrative complexity matters, right? So maybe you need to accidentally help a few people who don't need it in order to help the people that do need it. But I still don't agree with it. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Bruno.
I'm just saying that is another thing that, it would be a really big problem. Also, or you just decide, okay, we're gonna give it to whoever looks black.
Yeah.
But again, I think that's a terrible thing, because when you do things that are that significant to people, like getting a bunch of money because you look a certain way, all of those measures, even if they come from a place of good intentions, I think they divide society in a way that is very fundamental.
Yeah. I mean, you'd just be doing it that way for administrative simplicity, right? Like, so like not because it's actually not because it actually should be based just on the color of your skin, but just because it's an administratively easier way to do things. But I mean, that probably still isn't good, right?
Well, let's just bandy about a thought. This is not a mature thought, but let's just bandy this about. Let's suppose that, I don't know, let's say 5% of the federal budget is spent exclusively on programs for Black people. I don't think that's going to go over very well, but I don't know. Would it?
No, it wouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, from a political perspective, it certainly wouldn't. It's different, like the political perspective and the philosophical perspective. But I mean, if we're talking about something that you would actually implement in real life, that would be counterproductive. I mean, people would, there would be a lot of discrimination because of that. People would be tremendously resentful towards a certain community, and that never ends well. I mean,
so you might,
regardless of the community.
You might worsen the very problem you're trying to solve.
I think it would worsen the problem. I really do.
Yeah, I think the I think we should use like for example, if for people who are poor, they get welfare payments, right? If they're below the poverty line to a certain level, right? For people who are disabled, they might get support for that. But as far as race goes, I don't think like economic. I don't think we should give like just economic benefits based on race. I think to solve racial problems like discrimination, it's more about how we treat people. I don't think we should and I think that's the big problem with reparations, is that it's acting like race is an economic issue, which it's correlated with it, but that's not what I feel like a lot of them are, or like a lot of people who are discriminated against. That's not what I don't feel like they would really be happy with just being bought off, I guess. I don't know.
And that would have the same political effect as what we just discussed. I mean, that would be, people would really be resentful. That resentment, I don't think we can take that lightly. I mean, that would be some serious resentment. And that would, I think, backfire terribly, because at that point, we would have a very substantial part of the country, in this case, the United States, very substantial part of the population, very resentful towards one minoritary, a minority group. That's a very bad situation to have. And I think we have that in a way, but it would get, 20 times worse.
Yeah.
So that's really not something you want to do.
Yeah.
So how would reparations work? What would happen?
Well, Black people will get a bunch of money for being Black. I guess I think that's the proposal, but like, for all the reasons we just discussed, it's not a good proposal.
And they would get that money from the federal government?
Yeah, I would think so.
Is that not what I described?
Well, yeah, you said you would use the 5% to fund programs, right? Not necessarily give out money.
No. I didn't say that's what we should do. I was saying that if
Yeah,
we did that, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
that would come under the umbrella of reparations, I think. Yeah, that would be one way. I think when people think reparations, they usually think of a lump sum, but I mean that I guess that would be reparations actually.
But I'm not even saying so much that non-black people would dislike it. I think even black people might dislike it because that's the thing. We just assume, oh, we're giving them free money. That's like they would like it. They're just getting money, right? But I don't know if even they would really like it, because if I were one of them, I would kind of feel like I'm just getting bought off. Like it's not like past like the fact that African Americans were slaves like a couple decades ago. Like that's not something that can be solved like economically. That was a traumatic experience for their ancestors, right? That's not something you could just buy off. So if I were an African American, so I'm kind of just trying to put myself in their shoes, even though I've never been in their shoes, but just kind of trying to imagine it from their perspective, I would feel like you can't just buy me off. You know what I mean?
I think that's a good point. I agree with you. I don't think I would feel good. If I were in that position, I wouldn't feel good being bought off, like you say. I think that's very valid. I don't think I would feel good because I put myself in that position, but that's just like so many other things in life. If someone harms you in some way, in a serious way, I don't think just getting money for it would make the grievance go away. I think I think that would make things potentially worse because, like you said, at that point, it's kind of like it's over, right? You accepted the money. The implication is that it's over. And I don't think that's right. You hang on to things forever, but, it's not over.
Yeah, it's kind of like, yeah, I think I've already made my point on it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I believe that, and I'm kind of like repeating what I've said before, but just very briefly, a better way to repair things is to actually repair things, right? To go into the communities that need to be repaired, that need to be reformed, and actually spend the money, but not just giving handouts, just actually improving things, building better schools, funding things better, actually giving people the opportunity to succeed. And that is a form of reparation. You're repairing communities that are in need of something, for people of those communities to have a fair, fair conditions in life later on in life. So give them those conditions, give them those fair conditions. And I think that is a great way to repair things. And that doesn't need to be a racial thing. You just go into the neighborhoods where people do need help and you help them. And that is a good way to go about it, I think, instead of playing the whole reparations card.
Yeah. So another thing I thought about, what do you guys think? Well, I guess we kind of already touched upon this, but yeah, like scholarships for like minorities or disadvantaged students. Yeah, I guess we kind of already touched upon that when we talked about like college admissions a little bit.
Yeah, well, that also kind of like raises the questions of education in general and higher education. And I mean, personally, I think there should be some. I think that people should be able to afford college if they want if they want to go to college, because I just think it's crazy, and it didn't used to be like that in the United States, and it's not really like that anywhere else, that you go to college and you come out indebted for life. I mean, that is not a good thing. I don't think that's a good thing for anybody. Is that a good thing for society? No. Is that a good thing for the students? No. Is that a good thing for the government? No. I mean, it doesn't really help anybody.
When I first heard about an idea, I think it's floated around in liberal camps of making a community college free. At first I kind of bristled at that a little bit. I thought, oh, because my wife teaches high school, and you talk about people who feel entitled. You guys were in high school. You know how some people damage property, vandalize stuff, and if it's publicly funded, it's just expendable. It doesn't make it's not important. It doesn't. What my wife has encountered a lot of that. And when I first heard about making community college free, that's the first thing that came to my mind. Well, if you make community college free, then they're not going to enjoy that any more than they do the high school we have. But even though there are problems in public education, we still think there should be good public education. I think I got a better public education than my daughter did. And so I'm not sure I can describe what I'm after here.
No, I understand what you're saying. You're a little bit torn about it, and I kind of agree. Like, hearing you talk about it, I mean, I certainly, and I did teach in school as well, in high school and middle school, so I understand. But yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
What I learned was that in the late 1800s, early 1900s, high school wasn't free.
No.
People had to pay to go to high school. Now, and I grew up in a world where people could go to high school. And I think it was a good world. I still think it's a good world. But the problem with it today is not because of what it does. It's because of how poorly it does it. And so I've come full circle on the concept of paying for the first 2 years of college, because I'm thinking 100 years from now, we might think, well, duh. Yeah, of course. Just like we think about the 8th grade and high school,
It's like you're saying, it's a historical process. There's no fundamental difference between high school and college, right? I mean, it's like saying there's a fundamental difference between middle school and high school, or elementary school and middle school. It's just not the case. Like some people would think it outrageous that you would have a free high school, like in the beginning of the 20th century, when a lot of kids didn't even go to middle school. Middle school would be a luxury to a lot of kids. So high school would be preposterous. Right now it's commonplace, but in most countries in the civilized world, or in advanced economies, college, the ability to go to college is already commonplace, right? It's just the United States is still not like that, but it is like that in most advanced economies.
I read some newspaper. Well, actually, I read articles written today that included snippets from newspaper articles in 1900 or whenever high school was publicly funded. And the same arguments against funding high school were used then that are being used against funding community college for everybody now.
Interesting.
It's the same arguments. And maybe they're good arguments, but at least we have to recognize they're the same ones. So
It's just a matter of degree. How far do you go with it? Because yeah, like a lot of PhD programs are fully funded, right? That's kind of interesting. So yeah, we don't fund undergraduate education, but or at least it's not. I mean, I mean, if you go to your state college, it's still like the bulk of it is subsidized by most states, right? It's still expensive, but the bulk of it, the state helps out with, right? If you go to a college within your own state, like I know at least
in some cases the college helps out the state, not the other way around.
the college helps out the state.
Yeah, because colleges in the United States make a lot of money, so that makes sense. And the whole college sports things that generates a lot of money in some cases.
But it's always cheaper if you're in state than out of state, right? Isn't out of state always like more expensive?
Generally, it is.
I think so.
There are percentages that are goals within the university system. At least in North Carolina, I don't know about Minnesota.
And isn't the reason why it's cheaper in state because the government helps out, or is that not true? Isn't that generally true?
That's correct.
It's just not enough to make it cheap, but it's still expensive. But if the government does help out with a good amount of it, right?
Well, and I have to admit, sometimes I wonder about some of our state universities who charge more for out-of-state students. If the numbers are not to ensure that you have X number of students from in-state, but to ensure that you make a profit because you have X number of students from out-of-state.
Yeah, no, I'm sure
Which is it?
We should one of these days we can talk about education and college and we've already talked about education I guess one day, but we could talk about the economic angle because I think obviously that's a big question. But so since it's almost 9, did you guys change your mind about the way you think about affirmative action, or
I still don't know what I think.
yeah.
Yeah. Did I change my mind? Yeah, I'm still kind of not sure. Yeah.
I think we've established that there are pro and pro arguments, there are against arguments, so it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, I think I'm just more informed about it. I don't know if my opinion has changed, but I'm more informed. Yeah.
That's what we do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think having conversations about issues certainly helps us dissect these ideas a little bit better, process them better, and organize them better. So yeah, I agree. Although, I mean, I am more, I don't think it's a great idea in most cases. I do think that in most cases, but that is because I have a vision. I think by when you keep insisting on dividing people, I think that's, even if you're doing it for a good cause, I don't think the long-term outcome is going to be that great. So that's why I think it's better to avoid it. But
let me put it this way. If I were in a position of utter and complete ignorance, I could not reach a state where I understood all of the issues clearly and knew exactly how I felt about them without going through the things we learned in the conversation tonight.
So there's a plus.
Maybe our conversation will someday be helpful to someone to understand these issues. Well, we can hope so. We can hope that will be the case. In any case, it was a fun discussion to have, and I appreciate you guys taking the time to talk to me about this.
Thanks
Next
for
week we'll talk about universal basic income, which
that.
is David's suggestion. I think that's a very interesting topic.
Sounds good. Yeah, looking forward to it.
Maybe we'll see it happen in New York and sometime soon because Andrew Yang might become mayor. Maybe not, but we'll see.
Oh yeah, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah.
I hope he does. I'm curious how it'll work out. Yeah.
So we'll see what happens if that happens.
If it's a big mistake, you want it to happen in New York, right?
Well, I guess it's at the present time, it's better than happening in Minneapolis or North Carolina for us. So no, but it would be kind of a shit show if it's really bad because New York is such an important city. But no, I think that's one thing that maybe it's better to instead of doing it all at once, universal basic income, maybe it's better to test it out a little bit to see how it goes, just in case it's a complete disaster. You never know.
Yeah. Very
Anyways, thanks for watching us, guys, and that's it for today. Next week we'll talk about universal basic income. We'll